NATO leaders are meeting in the Spanish capital Madrid at this hour for a historic summit. They're expected to expand the alliance, inviting new members and boost its rapid deployment units. Speaking ahead of the official opening ceremony, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg called Russia the biggest threat since World War II.
I expect that when leaders agree the strategic concept, they will state clearly that Russia poses a direct threat to our security, and of course that will be reflected throughout the strategic concept. And also the other decisions we take, for instance, to invest more and also to upgrade and strengthen our collective defense and our deterrence and defense posture.
Well, at that NATO summit, members are expected to formally invite Finland and Sweden to join their ranks. Turkey had initially opposed their bid to join, but now agreed to support it, saying it had gotten the concessions it wanted.
On day one of what has been described as one of NATO's most important summits in years, a major breakthrough. Turkey dramatically dropped its opposition to Finland and Sweden becoming members of the military alliance. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had blocked the Nordic countries' membership bids because of what Ankara perceived as their support for Kurdish militant groups it designates as terrorists. But a meeting between NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg and leaders of the three countries at the start of the summit in Madrid quickly bore fruit.
In NATO, we have always shown that whatever our differences, we can always sit down, find common ground, and resolve any issues. NATO's open door policy has been an historic success. Welcoming Finland and Sweden into the alliance will make them safer, NATO stronger, and the Euro-Atlantic area more secure.
The countries signed a joint memorandum on their common security after the meeting. Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership now appears to be a formality. It's a big boost at the start of a gathering which NATO will use to set out its strategic agenda for the next decade. Shortly after arriving in Spain, US President Joe Biden emphasized the importance of the meeting to the host country's leader.
NATO. And Mr. President, you're hosting a truly historic summit and the key moment in our alliance. When Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine was shattered peace in Europe and shattered every norm since World War II that's been in place.
Another significant moment on day one, Stoltenberg announced that the organization plans to cut its civilian and military greenhouse gas emissions by at least 45% by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050. But the resolution of the row on Sweden and Finland is a show of NATO's unity and its growing strength at a moment when it badly needs both.
Well, let's talk a bit more about this. I'm now joined by DW's chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, here in this studio. And Terry Schultz also joins us. She's at that NATO summit in Madrid. Terry, let's start with you, please. This obstacle now seems to have been overcome. What vibes are you getting from NATO members about this?
Huge relief here at the NATO summit, Gerhard. This dispute threatened to cast a shadow over the entire summit, the entire event, where there are some really historic decisions to be made. That's not just rhetoric coming from Stoltenberg. There are a lot of huge changes that NATO is going to approve here at the summit. And now that Finland and Sweden, it looks like they're going to be allowed to join, although that will take some time. It's beneficial for NATO because they are going to be extremely strong allies, but also they can get on with the rest of the business.
Melinda, Erdogan has opposed the bid for them to join. Now they sat together at a table, talked, and now Erdogan says he's happy. What's the deal there?
Well, the two countries, Finland and Sweden, have promised that they would abjure, would reject any form of relationship with the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, and also with the northern Syrian Kurds Kurdish militia because, in fact, it was their supposedly too close relations with Kurdish groups that Erdogan cited as his main reason for objections. So they're often also promising to extradite Kurdish terrorists and the like. But behind the scenes, there were clearly some other more realpolitik factors that also played a role in this decision. One being that both countries will now lift their embargoes on imports of Turkish weapons, including Turkish drones. And Erdogan is very, very interested in selling more of these very popular Turkish-made drones. They have been used on the Ukrainian battlefield. So that's obviously something that will bring some money into his hard-pressed pocketbook. And beyond that, apparently the U.S. also let it be known behind the scenes that Turkey would continue to be frozen out of work on U.S. fighter jets if it did not practically take back its objections. So for all of those reasons, they did manage to get to yes, and this is a very significant move. NATO can't afford to look divided at this moment. And basically now the way is clear for Finland and Sweden to join, and that means the sea that we know as the Baltic is about to become essentially the NATO Sea, surrounded on almost all sides by NATO membership countries.
Can I just follow up on this? How will I don't think we have heard anything from Moscow yet, but how is Moscow going to react?
Well, interestingly enough, Moscow had indicated that it would view this as an existential threat, even in the course of this spring. It made some very menacing remarks about this possibility. But suddenly, since around mid-May, Putin and other Russian leaders have been singing quite a different tune, relaxing their rhetoric. Putin's saying, we don't have any disputes with these two countries. We don't have a problem with them. Nonetheless, they have made it clear they will be watching closely to see what kind of military infrastructure is positioned in these countries. And beyond that, they also have made it clear through other military spokespeople that should NATO in any way get close to Crimea, it's a very different game, and then even again talk of possible World War III.
Let's go back to Terry in Madrid there. What have Finland and Sweden actually agreed to?
When you go through this three-page trilateral memo that was signed yesterday, and if you know the history of these issues, you can see that actually the Nordic countries didn't give away nearly as much as Erdogan wants to make it seem like they did, because Finland and Sweden both already considered the PKK a terrorist organization, as does the entire European Union. So restating that is certainly, no problem for them. They also are countries that have a very strong judiciary and do not tolerate terrorist acts inside their country. Now, the question of extradition is going to be very sensitive and very tricky because the governments in these countries don't intervene in decisions about extraditions. And Sweden made this clear time and again also to President Erdogan that the judicial arm is completely independent of the government. So the government can't go in and say, sure, we'll extradite whomever Erdogan wants. So I would expect that we'll actually see very little change on the question of extraditing people that President Erdogan considers terrorists, because they will go through a process in Sweden and it will be determined whether or not they're guilty of these crimes and should be sent back to Turkey. The other thing is that Finland repeated time and again that it doesn't have an arms embargo on Turkey, even though that was something that the Turks kept mentioning. And Sweden has a very restrictive arms export policy that it has agreed to change, but it wasn't directed only at Turkey. There are also changes in terrorism laws in both of these countries that predate even their application for membership in NATO. So I think that President Erdogan is being allowed to use this as a propaganda win to some extent. But as long as this works for those three countries and gets Finland and Sweden in NATO, I think everyone's going to let that lie for the time being.
Terry, you're at the summit there. What other major decisions can we expect?
As I mentioned earlier, there are some really major decisions that are going to be approved by the 30 leaders here. In addition to formally opening accession negotiations with Finland and Sweden shortly after the summit. Today, for example, we're going to hear from President Zelenskyy, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, virtually, and the summit will approve a new assistance package for Ukraine. Now, again, these are not NATO weapons, but they're weapons and other forms of aid that NATO countries bring to the table, and this will be announced here at this summit. But in terms of how NATO itself will transform the rapid response force, these are troops that can be kept on high readiness in case something happens, in case there's a direct threat to NATO territory. That is going to be boosted from 40,000 to 300,000. Now, this is a huge difference for NATO. So what they're saying is, if we feel a direct threat to our territory, we've got 300,000 troops on standby, ready to come as quickly as possible. They're also going to decide to pre-position equipment and ammunition, for example, in frontline countries, so that while all these troops won't be on the ground all the time, they could move very quickly and they wouldn't have to bring everything with them. So there are a lot of big changes that are going to be made here. These are changes that frontline countries had been asking for even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But of course, everyone came to see the light after these developments.
Melinda, NATO has also invited outside countries to the summit. Why is that?
Absolutely. Quite interesting. They have invited Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, and one other that is escaping my memory, and Japan to attend, because China is also going to be on the agenda, and we're told that although the main focus now is, of course, on Russia, with what amounts to NATO's biggest collective defense overhaul since the end of the Cold War, they also are looking further into the future and beyond Europe to talk about what needs to be done to essentially defend against Chinese both hybrid warfare in the form of disinformation and such, and other more conventional threats that could emanate from China. So that's why those countries are also going to be there, and we will undoubtedly hear references to China shortly.
I can't help but getting the feeling, by the way, we're seeing live pictures there from Madrid, the leaders arriving, motorcades. I've seen the US president's car there already. This all sounds, Melinda, a bit like there's a new confrontation ahead. It reminds me a bit of the Cold War that we thought was overcome, really, and now sort of new blocks are forming or hardening, actually, the blocks that were formerly there. Is that a development that we should be worrying about?
Well, indeed, if you remember, at the very outset of the conflict, Secretary-General Stoltenberg of NATO said, Putin's looking for less NATO. He is going to wind up with more NATO. And in fact, in many ways, this conflict has revitalized the alliance and given it a new purpose. If you remember, during the era of Donald Trump, there were many people who wondered whether NATO could even continue to exist in view of
Trump called it irrelevant,
yes,
right?
And there were questions about whether he would actually withdraw the U.S. from NATO. For now, at least, those questions have absolutely been put on hold with truly a revitalized NATO making this major strategic shift. They're going to be announcing their first, essentially, strategic concept, new strategic concept in 10 years. And yes, it does represent a hardening, at least in relations with Russia. As you know, NATO and Russia had signed a basic treaty, a basic agreement that was supposed to ensure stable and even friendly coexistence. That is now also off the table, essentially the Russians having completely changed the circumstances on which that agreement was based. But whether this means a hardening across all sectors or only in the strategic and defense area? That is a major open question. You and I report a lot on international economic matters and trade. Many people are concerned that this hardening in the defense area could spill over into a hardening in the trade area as well. But when we talk to international business leaders, we're often hearing that that is something they absolutely want to prevent.
Terry, let's come back to you. You're stationed in Brussels at NATO headquarters. You've been covering NATO for many years. So this is the biggest strategy shift since the end of the Cold War. Melinda and you both have touched upon this. Just give me a sense of the meaning of this in the grand scheme of things.
Well, it can't be understated how much Russia did cause this, as Melinda mentioned. Now, they only come out with these strategic concepts about every 10 years, so it's not surprising that this is the year that they're going to revamp it. But basically, drafters had to rip up what they would have said, which would have envisioned some kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say friendlier, but more civil relationship with Russia. Now that is completely not going to be said. It is going to be stated very clearly that Russia is the major threat to NATO. And again, as Melinda mentioned, China will be mentioned for the first time. Now, we should also mention, since you brought up former President Trump, that another thing that's going to be happening at the summit is that they are going to be discussing how they're going to pay for all these huge boosts to their defenses. And as we all know, 2% used to be what the goal was for countries to spend 2% of their GDP on their own militaries so that there would be a lot of resources available should NATO need them. Now the language is that 2% is the floor and not the ceiling. Now, countries were supposed to reach that 2% of GDP level by 2024. Now they're going to be talking about how much more they're going to need to spend. So as we know, a lot of them haven't made it to 2% yet, but we are also seeing a lot of them go beyond 2% right now, Germany being one of them. So these changes that Russia has brought about in NATO really are massive, and not just in what you see in terms of troop availabilities and spending, but in the mindset of the NATO allies, realizing they have to be in this together, and a threat to one of them truly is a threat to all of them.
Terry Schultz in Madrid there, and Melinda Crane here in the studio. Thank you both very much. Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has addressed the United Nations Security Council, demanding that Russia be labelled a terrorist state. He also released a video claiming to show the moment when a missile struck a shopping mall in Kremenchuk on Monday, killing at least 18 people. Zelenskyy said the video is evidence that Russia deliberately targeted civilians. The video cannot be independently verified. Russia claims it fired precision-guided missiles at a weapons depot. Zelenskyy urged the Security Council to expel Russia from the United Nations.
It is imperative to deprive the Russian delegation of the opportunity to manipulate the UN. It is imperative to make it impossible for Russia to stay in the UN Security Council until it stops committing terrorism. It is imperative to establish a tribunal to investigate everything that the Russian military has done to the Ukrainians. And it is imperative to give the legal definition of state terrorism at UN level. Russia's actions must be investigated and global sanctions imposed for Russia's destruction of the international legal order.
Earlier, I spoke to DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kremenchuk, and I asked him about that video released by the Ukrainian government, which it says shows the moment of that explosion.
Well, this video that was shared, among others, by President Zelenskyy is you see a missile strike in the distance, and that we believe is the mall, and in the foreground you see the factory that is not hit. Obviously, no one has, since that video was released, been able to go there and verify that all those kind of locations stack up. We're hoping to get to the factory in the next few hours if we're allowed. There was also a version and explanation that was spread by the Russian authorities who say that actually the factory was hit and that the fire spread from there to this mall. That's something the Ukrainians dispute, say is totally absurd, and they point to some of the damage to the mall behind me and say that is impact, that is not fire, simply causing this mall to fall to pieces. So hopefully in the next few hours we'll have a bit more clarity about the kind of series of events and how it all fits together. But for now, obviously the Ukrainians trying to draw as much attention to this as possible and to really show the international community what impact this war is having on civilians hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines.
Now, it's 2 days after that attack. What's the mood like in Kremenchuk?
I think lots of people here just can't quite still believe it. They did kind of think that now this war had focused on those front lines, that the time was when basically all of Ukraine was under attack, that we saw in the beginning of this war in March and April, that was over. But this obviously has brought that back into really sharp focus, and I think this is the question now of all the air raid alarms, which often can be on for about 3-4 hours a day. Are people really going to now basically go to their cellars every time they hear a siren? Because it does make living an ordinary and normal life, going about your business, going about your job, very, very difficult. So people now really faced with a stark choice between maximum safety and potentially not being able to go about normal life and earn a living, and following those safety precautions.
Now, Nick, I want to talk to you about this. The Russian news agency TASS just announced that the Russian-controlled Ukrainian region of Kherson has begun preparations for a referendum on joining Russia. What do you know about this?
I think this is first and foremost a threat. This obviously is a reminiscent of what Russia did in Crimea, holding a referendum that the outside world and obviously Ukraine, first of all, does not recognize as fair or free. It's a threat, I think, to Ukraine that if it carries on trying to advance in that part of Ukraine in the south, where actually Ukraine is making quite significant advances, that Russia will basically call this region part of Russia and then threaten to use nuclear weapons to protect it against Ukrainian advances as part of Russia's core territory. I think it's also a threat to the wider world, with Solidarity for Ukraine picking up, and in recent weeks we've had increasing promises of deliveries of really high-tech Western weapons. Russia's increasingly feeling the pain from those strikes in Donbass. So I think for now this is a threat. If it happens or not, it's not immediately going to happen. It's most likely going to take some time, but definitely Russia putting up the diplomatic pressure and showing the outside world and Ukraine that it's willing to escalate.
Our correspondent Nick Connolly there, reporting from Kremenchuk in Ukraine. Thank you, Nick.